Welcome to Careers in Discovery, where you'll meet scientists who've forged outstanding careers in biotech and hear about what they've learned along the way. This podcast is brought to you by Singular, building brilliant biotechs. Namir Hassan is the CEO of Zelluna Immunotherapy, a cancer cell therapy company harnessing natural immunity to treat solid tumours. Namir joined us on Careers in Discovery to talk about when precision medicine gets too precise, the importance of servant leadership, trusting the journey in your career, and a whole lot more. So I'm back on Careers in Discovery, this time with Namir Hassan of Zelluna Immunotherapy. Namir, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Great to see you. And Namir, I'm really interested to dive into, the story of your career, the journey that you've been on. But would love to start by talking a little bit about the very exciting work that you're doing at Zelluna. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Absolutely. Again, thanks for having me. Maybe I can start with the context and maybe painting a little bit picture about what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So currently there's probably about 10 million deaths caused by cancer. The overwhelming majority are caused by solid tumors. So these are the likes of lung cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, and so on. And so there's a real unmet medical need in the treatment of solid tumors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the last 10 years or so, there have been some arguably revolutionizing therapies that have come through, largely based on harnessing the immune system to really drive a response against cancers.
Yes.
And so what we're doing is we're developing a platform that sits within that overarching immunotherapy space. And then specifically, when we think about what are those therapies that perhaps are providing the potential promise of a cure, cell therapies, so those are the cell therapies whereby cells are engineered to better recognize cancers, and they're typically cells of the immune system, T cells, for example, have really shown incredible responses in liquid cancers, but haven't shown the same penetration in solid cancers.
Right.
And indeed, in liquid cancers, they've shown, in some cases, cures, arguably. And now, how do we define cures? That's where the tumors, or in the case of liquid cancers, the cancers have been eliminated, and the patients are cancer-free for at least 10 years and remain cancer-free. So there was an article talking about cures a couple of years ago, which monitored patients that were 10 years plus cancer-free.
Yes.
And so we firmly believe in cell therapies, and we believe in the potential of driving cures with cell therapies. Now, there are two major challenges with then applying those cell therapies, despite the promise, to solid tumors. The first, and maybe taking the biological challenge first, the scientific challenge, is that over the last years, we have moved more and more to precision medicine, really precise medicines that can target cancers in a way that allows the toxicity profile to be manageable.
Right.
Now, that's been great from the perspective of safety, and in some cases has helped to penetrate cancers. Now, the Achilles heel there is that we're dealing with very diverse tumors. So within a single patient and a tumor from that patient, the cancers will have a variety of different patterns on their cell surface.
Yes.
So when you're targeting with a precise agent, cancers can avoid that because some parts of the cancer may not present that target for the therapeutic. And indeed, it's been shown through clinical development that other parts of the cancer that were initially responsive lose the target, the single target, and thereby escape.
I see. Okay.
So diversity of cancers has been a real major challenge to really driving durable responses. So we aim to tackle that by one of the aspects of our platform, and I'll come on to talk about that in a moment. But the other side, the other major challenge with cell therapies, with the main cell therapies that have been approved right now, which are autologous T cell therapies mainly.
Yes.
And that's where a patient's own T cells are taken, engineered, manufactured, and reintroduced, a process of about 30 days or so, or some cases shorter than that. It's a very costly process. Cost of goods are particularly high. Scaling that process is very difficult. And they're typically treated in specialist centers rather than community centers, and need to be in the hospital on account of the toxicities that emerge initially.
Yes.
So not very scalable to the enormous unmet medical need.
Yeah.
So here's where we think we come in, where we have an approach, which is a cell therapy. We use natural killer cells rather than T cells. And natural killer cells naturally can be used in an off-the-shelf manner. But by that, I mean my natural killer cells can be used with you, Tom, without causing any toxicities. So they're naturally allergenic, as it were. So we've opted for that cell type as a consequence of that feature, and also they're incredibly potent and have been shown for decades to be safe in patients.
Yeah, interesting.
Now, where natural killer cells struggle is in actually penetrating solid tumors, and that's where our second component comes in, and that is by engineering the natural killer cells with a scaffold called the T cell receptor. It's a guidance system, as we like to call it. We know that scaffold has clinically proven ability to target solid tumors when it's used in T cells. And we've got growing clinical data showing that TCR T cells, for example, can penetrate solid tumors in a prevalent way across various companies and groups. So the TCR scaffold has that ability to target solid tumors. So we introduce that into natural killer cells to generate TCR NK cells. And so that's our approach. And so how does that then address the challenge of heterogeneity and diversity? Well, then you have multiple levers for the therapeutic that can trigger TCR NKs. On the one hand, you have the T cell receptor that recognizes antigen on cancers.
Yes.
And you also have the repertoire of natural killer receptors. And there are at least 8 activating receptors that recognize stress ligands, a variety of different ligands on cancers. And so you have this multi-sensing therapeutic that we believe brings together the best of both worlds, targeting ability of a TCR and the potent pan-cancer recognition and activity of natural killer cells in a way that they can be used off the shelf, frozen, taken and used at the point of need, scaled from a single batch, so minimizing cost of goods.
Yeah, I see. And I was just going to pick up on that point, actually, the sort of allergenic concept being one that could significantly reduce the cost of cancer treatment in the future as well, right? But also, I suppose if you're dealing with autologous therapies, you're extracting immune cells from patients who are already weak. They're already finding things difficult. That can cause complications in itself, I suppose. So that it's one less thing that you need to do to the patient, right?
That's a very good point. That the immune system over the course of treatment, lines of treatment are battered, and so dysfunctional in various ways. They're stimulated when taken ex vivo to try to overcome that, but nonetheless, there's quite some data that demonstrates that there is a dysfunction and a compromise there. So we're taking healthy donor natural killer cells, and we go through a process of generating from a single batch at scale in order to produce multiple vials to treat patients. And so we look at those that can give the highest performance. And so we can screen different healthy donors to look for those that can give the highest performance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the point you make about precision medicine is an interesting one, because I think, precision medicine is a very popular concept right now, right? And it's
Yeah, it is.
there's lots of potential advantages to it, and I think there's lots of potential in the concept as a whole. But your point's an interesting one in that if you try and make everything more and more precise, at some point you become so precise that you miss the big picture, right? And and cancer's a fairly creative disease, and we'll find ways around things that are that are too specific. I haven't looked at it that way before. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's I mean, they're incredibly diverse, as you
Mm.
know, from the genetic level, the protein level, and we're seeing more and more clinical evidence suggesting that whilst you get in some cases, responses initially, you get relapse quite quickly. And, the way I like to think about it is that, in some ways, an ideal therapeutic is precise and broad. What we've
Yes.
had previously is we've had broad-based therapies that caused systemic toxicities. Then we moved to precise therapies that were safer systemically, but hadn't had the breadth to really deal with the diversity of cancers, which is what we're seeing now. So I
Yes.
think a combination, blending precision and breadth, really is how I think about it.
Makes sense. So to find
Mm.
ways to get precise enough,
Yes.
and not too, yeah, okay. And at the moment, Namir, given the stage the company is at, so as CEO, everybody approaches that chief executive role slightly differently, spends their time on different things. Where does your focus tend to go? What does your role look like these days?
Very much eclectic. I mean, one of my core passions is really to try to unleash maximum potential from
Mm.
people. Over the last 15 years, I have been privileged enough to either lead groups, organizations, divisions, and now Zelluna. And really, my principal aim there is to adopt what I call a servant leadership style and really try to remove hurdles and unleash maximum potential from people. So there is a culture piece, which is incredibly important,
Mm.
and what we do with the culture. So we have what we call a Zelluna Academy, which is a symbolic, let's say, initiative there to really state that we're deliberately thinking about our culture. And under that, we have a number of different initiatives. And really,
I
all of
see.
that is to try to produce and try to continue to develop a culture that encourages growth at a personal level and a collective level, and we have various initiatives around that. So quite a significant amount of my time is really spent to deliberately think about that and
Mm.
support people and culture. That's one aspect. And of course, there are various other aspects. There's the oversight across operations generally.
Yes.
We are in a space where it is a complex process going from discovery through to translation in the clinic. And again, privileged enough to have a management team with deep experience across that entire spectrum. And I see my role as overseeing that and trying to support in the ways that I can to guide that too. And of course, there's another arena, which is sustaining the organization from
Yep.
a finance perspective. And so that's, storytelling, trying to really
Yes.
entice potential investors in what we're doing. I mean, we really believe we have a highly differentiating platform that really addresses one of the key challenges of treating solid tumors. So in some ways, the story sells itself, but nonetheless, it really requires careful sort of
Mm.
sequencing and interaction. And so investors and investor discussions, of course, is another large part of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're here mostly to talk about your career, Namir, but I'm in the
Mm,
culture business myself, so I always find culture very interesting.
yeah.
So you mentioned some of the things culturally that you've worked on at Zelluna are
Mhm.
around, and unleashing people's potential, focusing on growth and development. Can you tell us a bit more about the culture?
I can, yeah. So, I would say probably about something like 8 years or so ago. So before joining Zelluna,
Mm.
and I joined in 2018. Prior to that, I was at Immunocore, a biotech company just south of Oxford. And in
Yes.
my last period of time at Immunocore, I spent almost 10 years there. A good friend and colleague of mine were asked to build a division essentially that deploys the platform. This was Immunocore's platform in infectious diseases. And
Mm.
so we both had come to that point on our own journeys really thinking about culture, and then had an opportunity there and then to create something essentially from the ground up. It was a
Yeah, I
unit
see.
within Immunocore to create it from the ground up. And so we then explored different ways of doing things and looking at how different practices resonated with what we felt would encourage some of the things that we had been thinking about. And what resonated to us as a framework was what's called these teal organizations. Frederick Laloux talks about this in
Okay.
Reinventing Organizations. And teal-based organizations essentially are driven by three principles. First is purpose, a clear purpose, the why, as Simon Sinek puts it. You know, what is driving you? The second is self-management. So this is different to independence, but it's a real sort of self-management where there is a empowerment, support. You have an advice process to help groups and individuals, but there's a self-management there that allows those that are closest to the work to make the decisions, so-called high-velocity decision making,
Yeah, okay.
and rather than going to a central location to
Yes.
request the ability to make the decision. And then the third is essentially authenticity. So to really show up as yourself. And that requires psychological safety, which we've heard a lot about in this space. Requires the ability to be vulnerable and to trust and be trusted. So there's a piece there on developing psychological safety in the company. So we're also looking at those principles, and in fact, we've moved one step further as scientists. We're trying to measure that now. So we have
Okay.
surveys that measure some of this, like psychological safety, for example. And so those are some of the principles, and that's what we're aiming to do. All of which is designed to, as I say, unleash maximum potential and growth in the people.
Yeah, interesting. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, I suppose, or I'll ask another question about this because I think it's really useful from a career perspective as well. I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of scientists at the start of their career think this is the fluffy stuff, right?
Yeah,
And some
yeah.
of them stay with that through their whole career, and some of them sort of encounter things that change their mind.
Mm.
You obviously trained as an immunologist. What why do you think you ended up with this focus on culture, and what has been the impact of culture in your career, do you think? I haven't prepared you for this question, and it's maybe a big one.
No, that's so. I would say that I probably had a natural inclination to what's called servant leadership, and that's
Yeah,
partly
okay.
down to perhaps my upbringing, traditional values, religious values. I had a natural. It also speaks to the decisions along the way to be doing what I'm doing now, which is trying to
Mm,
develop medicines to help people. Ultimately, initially. When I was younger, I had it in my mind that I wanted to perhaps be a doctor because
right.
it brought together my interest in science with wanting to serve others. And so that sort of servant mindset, I think, developed. And as I was started to work, let's say, after academia and in a professional company setting, pharmaceutical or biotech, I found myself being invited to, lead individuals, lead
Mm,
groups, and then to lead divisions, and then ultimately to lead an organization and a company. And perhaps, that had happened because of the servant mindset to try to offer support and help to those that I'm working with, and then along the way, those that I am ultimately responsible for. As it said, rather than being in charge, taking care of those in your charge,
yes.
as Simon Sinek again puts it. So I think there's an element of an inclination in that direction, and then over the course of time, as I say, being invited to do this. And then I would say where it really came together to be tested in a deliberate manner was when I mentioned the time where a
Mm,
colleague and good friend of mine were asked to build this division. And we also faced we worked, as we put it, not only in the organization but on the organization,
Right.
which meant developing a program actually in the end with executive coaches, which took time away from the doing.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the sense of the outcomes from that are not immediate. And so
Right.
that
Yeah.
for some, the natural response is to think that there's perhaps no point in doing this
Mm.
because the fruits are not borne out immediately like an
Yes.
experiment comes through and
Yes.
the data comes through in a few days. And so there was that hesitancy by a significant proportion. But then over time, as we had seen the effect, and I would say the most profound metric that we could point to was that we had substantially reduced one of the cycle times in a project,
Okay.
um, because people had felt they can be open, they can challenge the status quo. Why are we doing this the way we're doing it? Why can we not do
Mm.
it this way? And that was down to the psychological safety we believe that we created. So we cut down a cycle time for a particular pathway from discovery to candidate selection significantly, something like by about 30% or so. And so that became a metric that we could point to. And then later, as as we sort of disbanded and some people left, I'm still getting messages from folks looking back, thinking, I know I was skeptical, but I'm so glad of that journey and the
Yes.
growth and the how it set me up for my next stage in my career.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's not, the wisdom is not clear at the time, but when you look back, it then opens
Mm.
itself up and reveals itself, I think.
Yeah, and no one operates independently to their environment, right? And it doesn't
No,
matter how brilliant they are or how independent they feel they are, the culture they find themselves in has an impact on how they
absolutely.
perform and how they operate.
Yeah.
Um, Interesting. And then you've come back around and started to apply some scientific principles to it now and started to measure it and do those sorts
Yeah.
of things.
Yeah, we are. So, it's difficult. It's not so straightforward and easy to
No.
find surveys like this to really test some of the principles that you're interested. But we found one that really tests some of these elements that we're trying to nurture, like psychological safety, for example,
Mm.
and flow state. So, how often are people in that flow state where they're really performing at their best in that moment?
Yeah, I
Can
see.
we measure that? Because that's another indicator of thriving, let's say, a thriving culture. Um,
Mm.
Sense of belonging. So what we measure are those three things. We measure psychological safety, flow state, and a sense of belonging.
Okay.
So how do people feel that they're part of something bigger, and they feel part of the Zelluna tribe or Zellunians, as it were.
Yes.
You know, do they feel that people have got their back and are supporting them and that kind of those kind of things?
Yeah, I see. And I mean, I assume that this is the case. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you feel from what you're seeing that having that real focus on those things is making the business more effective, helping people perform better, helping you. I guess the measurement will also help you to look at, well, where can we improve? Where can we find those further gains, and where can we find those other areas to build on?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not easy.
No.
Biotech is relentless. There's never enough time. So whenever we try to carry out an initiative, it always feels like it comes at the wrong time. So none of this is perfect,
Yeah.
but I think that it's overall net positive and has been net positive for us.
Yeah.
But it's a challenge. It is a challenge. We're a group of about 24 people,
Mm.
and we have very ambitious timelines and ambitious goals and lofty aims, and it's a challenge, but I do think overall it's net positive, and that's been the overwhelming feedback from the
Yeah.
company.
Yeah. And I suppose culture is a little bit like biology in that it's not static or clean or
Absolutely. Yeah.
or simple,
Absolutely.
right? It's
That's
always
right.
moving. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I could talk about this for the rest of the session, so I
Yeah.
apologize to the people who tuned in to hear about your career. We will get into that now.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, we kind of touched on some of the early reasons for this career path for you. So, you know, you were interested in science anyway. You wanted to find ways to help people, but tell us a little bit more about that, about, you know, why science, why immunology, why drug development, you know,
Yeah.
what were the origins of this career for you?
Yeah, I can sort of walk you through it. Maybe there's some of
Mm,
the key milestones as I think about it, looking backwards.
yeah.
You know, again, I think it did really start from this desire to help and support people, sort of this inclination in that direction. And then I was always fascinated with science, always fascinated with the workings of the human body, fascinated with the intricacies of that. And so in my mind, where I could potentially apply those two things together was in medicine.
Hmm.
And then for various reasons, that didn't happen. And I started I went into a degree in biotechnology. And that for me was also another way of blending
Yes.
science in support of health of others. And so I embarked on my degree in biotechnology. And interestingly, I avoided with a passion the modules on the immune system,
Oh, really?
with a passion. And so one of the formative moments in my career was that I did a sandwich placement, which, you know, I was the only one actually in the year to
Mm,
do that. It was a fairly new degree. I'm giving away my age now. It was a fairly new degree at UCL Biotechnology. And I was the only one to take the sandwich placement, and you know,
yeah.
I had to arrange that with some support of the university, and did that at GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, at the Harlow site, which later closed
Hmm.
down. And so when I did that, I was in the discovery research side of the organization. What that showed me and what became clear to me were two things. One was that I wanted to work in industry. I could see
Yes.
the application of science to developing drugs. I was experiencing, I was thriving in it. And the second was to do a PhD. I
Mm,
felt I really wanted to delve deep into a particular area. And incidentally, I did a PhD in immunology
right.
in T cell receptors, you know, the very subject that I avoided with a passion
Yeah.
during my degree. And that's where I was introduced to the T cell receptor scaffold, you know, arguably the most powerful biological entity that exists. It makes the decision between, you know, triggering to kill or not.
Hmm.
And so that was really interesting and exciting. And I did a PhD in understanding how T cells are activated via the T cell receptor.
Yes.
And essentially, I've been dancing with T cell receptors for about 15 years, really, my career, developing T cell receptor based therapies over the course of my
Mm,
career. So after my PhD, I moved back to GSK,
yeah.
almost in the same desk as I was, you know, a few years prior. You know how the dots are connected.
Yes.
Um, and then decided after a while that I really wanted to move into biotech. You know, I wanted to move into a small, nimble organization, have the exposure across the widest scope from discovery
Hmm.
through to regulatory, clinical, and came across Immunocore that were developing T cell receptor based therapies,
Yeah.
and decided to join. I was the first employee from industry. Actually, I think
Ah, I see.
that's
Okay.
the right statistic. Yeah, 41st employee,
Hmm.
and so was there for about 10 years. And so when I look back, you know, as it said, you can only connect the dots looking backwards rather than
Yes. Yeah.
looking forwards. The way I sort of read that story is I did a degree in biotechnology, um, learned how to, and then a PhD in immunology, and then moved into industry to professionally learn how to develop drugs,
Mm,
discover and develop drugs in a large professional organization with,
yes.
you know, with all of the discipline that brings in terms of managing matrix programs and all of the disciplines that brings, and then moved to use the immune system that I was studying my PhD to really harness the immune system to fight cancer and apply the professionalism that I had learnt in large pharma to hopefully to support a small biotech.
Yes.
And so spent about almost 10 years at Immunocore, and it was a remarkable journey going from discovery all the way through to early phase clinical studies, and overseeing, at one point that entirety of that space, including a first in human study for a molecule that became approved in uveal melanoma called Kimtrac, which has been an incredible privilege to be a part of.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, as you say, a very interesting time to be part of that company, I'm sure, going from sort of 41st employee to taking things into
450.
yeah, absolutely. And becoming a clinical company and spinning out different things and getting into infectious diseases and all those kinds of things, as you say. When you look at Immunocore particularly, and the transition that company went on, I guess a couple of things. So you'd come from GSK, and in terms of scale, there's probably not too much further you could have gone from either end of the spectrum to there.
That's right.
So I was interested in your first impressions, and then I was also interested in what the things are that you think made that Immunocore journey successful, both for the company and for you.
I think I can tell you what my actual first impression was when I stepped into Immunocore. You could perhaps imagine the scene. At Harlow, we had a water fountain fronted entrance. It's a pretty elaborate glass fronted building. As I went into Immunocore for the first time, it's, they're World War II bunkers, the original buildings, right? You go in and, it's a stark difference. But I found incredible charm in those buildings because the science was mesmerizing. As I like to say, they're World War II bunkers with molecular ammunitions inside to kill off cancers. The science was really mesmerizing. And I think that speaks to your second question, which is what made it successful. I think there are two things in particular. One is we were doggedly driven by the science, objectively driven by the science. I remember Ben Jacobson, the founder of the company's really good friend, now known him for 15 years. He's actually our executive chairman at Zelluna.
Yes.
I remember a conversation with him where he had said that if the data demonstrates that this doesn't have potential, we should have no issues with walking away. I mean, it was just that objective. So driven by the science and also the culture. The culture, I think, was really well nurtured, and that comes from the leadership. A culture where every voice counts, where there is the empathy, the compassion, where I would say there was that psychological safety before psychological safety was, the word, the two words to band around the organizational development circles. So I think culture and really driven by the science. So I think those were two of the key things.
And I suppose those two things go hand in hand as well, right? If you are genuinely going to be driven by the science and the data, then you have to create an environment where everybody has a voice and everybody can raise their hand and question and dissent, in a constructive way. But otherwise,
Absolutely.
you lose the objectivity to focus on the science, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so you touched on earlier as well, Namir, that you perhaps had a disposition to leadership roles that perhaps your approach to things lent you to those sorts of opportunities. From a career perspective, going through your sort of rise at Immunocore, and then of course you joined Zelluna as chief scientific officer and later CEO. What do you think were the key lessons you had to learn in terms of advancing your career as time went on?
Tom, I would say that I hadn't been one that really planned to go for particular roles. I think planning is helpful, but one can plan too much.
Hmm.
What I would say was that I was generally very curious, generally tried to support and have the initiative, let's say, to um, plug holes where I could perhaps see that there were holes there, and really try to find ways to help progress whatever initiative, company, project, group. And so in doing that, I found that I was, in some ways invited really to take on the roles. I remember one particular occasion, which was particularly, I would say, from a career perspective, very intense, was
Mm.
when I was leading research biology and translational medicine at Immunocore. And so working very closely with the head of development who was overseeing the clinical study.
Yes.
And then she moved on. And I remember a conversation where I was, asked to also then oversee development and the clinical study. And so that at that point, the span became extremely broad from
Hmm.
discovery all the way through to the clinic and back again. And so I did that, and I guess perhaps the struggle I especially had in the sort of first part of my career was to say no to things,
Right. Okay. Yeah.
which which can be a challenge for some. Um, but I think it's really very much that it's driven by the desire to help and support, driven by the desire to really find ways to make progress, true
Mm.
progress, and perhaps a lean to supporting others that
Yeah.
sort of came together to result in these invitations for these various roles. I would say I had been, when I was at GSK, I was quite enamored by this concept of having the breadth of experience in pharma and biotech.
Hmm.
So I had this in my mind at the time at GSK that it could be incredibly valuable, really, to have the experience across both pharma and biotech. So that was one thing that I did have in my mind as I was thinking about the career, but I hadn't really thought about particular roles
Yes.
and aimed for those. The other occasion was when we were asked to develop this division that applies the technology to infectious diseases. Again, we were, a colleague and friend of mine were invited to do that together. So I would say it's, planning has its benefits, but I think one can plan too
Mm.
much. Desires change, motivations change, opportunities come and go. And, as they say, you could be in the right place at the right time for you.
Yeah.
Um, Again, same goes when I moved as from a chief scientific officer to a CEO. I had never sat down and thought I'd like to be a CEO.
Okay.
I actually, frankly, had never thought about that at all.
Right.
Not in the sense that, oh, this is something that I would want to do. I mean, obviously you may think about these things or they, come across your mind, but I'd never sat and targeted
Mm.
to be a chief executive officer. But then, as it so happens and circumstances arose, was asked to lead Zelluna. Um, so again, as I say, planning, but not planning too much, trusting the journey,
Yes.
putting your best foot forward, trusting the journey, always trying to give it your best.
Yeah.
Um, and then I think, when you look back, you start to be able to connect some of those dots that may
Right.
seem a bit obscure um, when you're sort of looking ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose there's an element in there as well, Namir, of taking the opportunity when it presents itself, right? Because there was
Yeah,
some fairly big shifts fairly big steps that you took in your career to oversee clinical development, to move into infectious diseases, to take on the CEO role. Um, I suppose you've got to back yourself to take the opportunity when it arises as well.
agree.
Yeah, yeah.
And it needs to be maybe preparing yourself for those
Okay.
opportunities because you never know when they arise. And so, what does that preparation look like? Is a good question.
Yes, true.
And then we come back to, I would say, there's skill set. but more and more, if I was to, I'm quite simplistic in my thinking. If I was to bring it down to one thing, I think it's this idea of operating in uncertainty.
Okay.
I think as particularly in science, the more one's career progresses, the more one finds themselves needing to operate in uncertainty. And as they say, we're living in this VUCA environment, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and so operating in uncertainty. And so how does one do that? How does one sort of train for that, practice for that, develop the mindset for that, and continue to sort of evolve and develop in order to be able to operate in that environment, I think is a would be an important area to really focus on.
And on that point, any things in particular that have worked for you? Anything that you found useful to develop that muscle?
Yeah, I mean, there are certain mentors I have. Some of them quite ancient mentors, and so I pick up their literature quite often, and it helps to really provide that balanced mind, let's say. Um, Lao Tzu, for example, Tao Te Ching, or meditations from Marcus Aurelius. A lot of it goes to um, keeping your head, when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, as
Yes.
Rudyard Kipling says, that balanced mind. It's also the ego, really keeping the ego in check in order to really make considered decisions. Ultimately, it comes down to decision making, considerations of the information, how one brings others in. So all of that, I think, comes about through certain mindsets, through certain practices, and I think we've lost maybe some of that in some of the traditional literature, perhaps.
Yes.
So I often reach back to that, really, to help bring me back down to perhaps back down to earth, as they say.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You read sort of more modern business literature, particularly, and things like that, and they can provide all these frameworks for decision making and strategic thinking and that kind of stuff. But as you say, they tend not to engage with the emotional part of that, and the bit of
Yeah,
when you're taking a risk, your stomach tightens up, or
yeah, yeah,
those sorts of things. And
yeah.
that's just as crucial, right? You've got to make yourself effective in those situations, and just because you're the CEO of a company doesn't mean that you don't feel those emotions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how you show up plays a huge role in the whole organization.
Yes.
And so when an apparent crisis emerges, everybody will be looking to you to see how you respond to that crisis. And there will be ripples across the organization based on how one responds to that. So I think that sort of degree of uncertainty really grows through a career. It grows through those that are managing people in terms of the uncertainty of the nature of the people and how they show up and how to respond to that. And then it grows as you manage larger organizations and sort of oversee operations. And so I really believe it's a huge area to try to develop. And the one thing that I would say that I think sets people apart in more senior
Yes.
roles.
Yeah. And this may be a continuation of that, or it may be something we've touched on already, or perhaps something completely different. But thinking back, if there was perhaps one thing you know now that you wish you knew at the start of your career, what would you say that would be?
Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time wondering, given that I initially wanted to do medicine, I spent quite a bit of time wondering where I will end up and
Right.
how the career will develop from this biotechnology degree, where, this was in the 90s, where it was a new degree at the time, and we didn't have the innovations and the plethora of possibilities that we have now
Yes.
for the life sciences. So I would say trusting the journey, really. trusting the journey and trying to follow the passion, the instinct, taking the next right steps, as I try to say to others, taking the next right steps and not planning too far ahead. But really trusting the journey would have probably saved me quite a bit of concern and worry.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean. So thinking about the next right steps, what's next for Zelluna? What's on the agenda
So
over the
we're
next
very
12
excited
months or so?
because we're very excited because we're aiming to apply the platform and our lead asset into patients in the clinic. So we're
Okay.
en route to be ready for an IND submission to the FDA by the end of this year.
Fantastic.
So the next phase is really to test and see if the science plays out in patients. I mean, it's incredibly compelling preclinically. And the next thing to do is really to see if we can help make an impact on patients and really make a difference there.
Fantastic. Well, it's an incredibly exciting time for you. We wish you absolutely the best of luck.
Thank you very much.
And it's been fantastic to talk to you, Namir. Thank you for joining us.
You as well, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks very much for listening. Careers in Discovery is sponsored by Singular, helping you to build a brilliant biotech company. Biotech leaders spend far too much time, money, and energy on hiring and people issues. Head to www.singular-biotech.com to learn how you can recruit and engage your team more effectively so you can focus on developing medicines, treating patients, and saving lives.